It is a Seattle Kraken game day, and Joey Daccord is going the distance. We'll talk about it on today's episode of Locked On Kraken, live from Climate Pledge Arena.
You are Locked On Kraken, your daily podcast on the Seattle Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what do you say, Seattle hockey fans? Welcome to another episode of Locked On Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. My name, Erica L. Ayala, your host of Locked On Kraken, also the founder of Black Rosie Media, where we empower Black women and melanated creators in sports media. You can probably hear a little bit of the nice dulcet sounds here from Climate Pledge Arena. Did I use that word right? I don't know. Either way, the tunes here from Climate Pledge Arena as the Seattle Kraken host the Vancouver Canucks in the preseason game number 3. And we're going to talk about that, who we're expecting in net. I already gave you a teaser there, what the roster is going to look like, and what Dan Bylsma had to say about coming into this game, knowing they're effectively on a back-to-back against the Vancouver Canucks. But then we also talked with Zane yesterday about how this team is also literally playing back-to-back as they will play Edmonton tomorrow. Before we get too far into it, want to let you know today's episode of Locked On Kraken brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. So visit FanDuel.com to get started. And I want to get us started talking about Joey Daccord. He's who we're going to see in net. He's expected to play the entire game. And you know, I spoke to Zane about this just yesterday, and he and I are going to follow up next week. But I was hoping we would get to the part in preseason where we'd see a little bit more from who we're expecting to be the starting goaltenders here in Seattle. And so we're going to get that today. We're going to get a full game of Joey Daccord. At least that is the plan. And I'm excited for this. We knew, and we've talked about it through the offseason. Last year, Joey Daccord was coming into preseason fighting for a roster spot. This year, potentially, he's fighting for the starting goaltender spot. Now, how much of that is real? How much are we going to see Grubauer and Joey Daccord kind of split and work in tandem? I think it's still a little bit early in preseason to identify that. But what I can tell you is at least early returns, I'm not worried about goaltending right now at this point in the preseason. I think we're going to have pretty solid goaltending between Philip Grubauer and Joey Daccord. Both seem healthy. We'll find out tonight. But I am very excited to get a really good look at Joey Daccord. And so as we're talking about Joey, I also want to talk about the roster that we're going to see overall. And this is the roster that was shared with us from the Seattle Kraken. And so here's the roster that we have that was shared with us from the Seattle Kraken PR. I have it on the screen here for you. For those listening on audio, I will walk you through it. So on the screen, we have the roster, but I'm going to go through what we saw at practice, which is likely going to be what we see as far as the forward lines and defensive pairs. So you've got Ellie Tolvanen, Matty Beniers, and Oliver Bjorkstrand. Potentially, maybe, possibly, my new favorite line. McCann, Wright, and Eberle. I love when you have any of the 3 J's together. You know how I feel about that. Then we have Schwartz, Stevenson, and Tanev. And Zane and I talked a little bit about that line in particular because we know that Andrei Burakovsky had been skating with Schwartz. We also see that we have Cartier, Yanni Gord, and Ryan Winterton. And then Hayden and Stevens are the 2 forwards that will rotate in and out. On the defensive side, you have Brooks and Dunn, Lars and Dunn together, Oleksiak with Montour, Evans with Borgen, and Mahura and Fleury. And we have, of course, Joey Daccord going in net. Now, we saw Grubauer on the ice a little bit, but we're expecting Nicolas Coco to be the second goaltender for today. So, I mean, from this list, we heard from, Dan Bylsma. He's been very complimentary, and he's also been asked a lot about Chandler Stevenson. And so I want to take you actually to Dan Bylsma talking about Chandler Stevenson today after morning's.
can't be overstated his intelligence of which he plays the game. I think, he's got a reputation for being a smooth skater and a fast speed, but I've been thoroughly enjoyed seeing how smart he is and how he plays the game and his intelligence he brings to the game. So I don't want to say that's been a surprise to me, but that's been enlightening, and can't wait to see it. Bring it to our team.
So that's Dan Bylsma talking about Chandler Stevenson. Again, we are expecting to see him in the lineup today. He spoke to us as media, and I've talked about this before. Very soft-spoken, kind of easygoing guy. But as you heard from Dan Bylsma, and as we've heard Zane talk about on the show, he can skate. His IQ is super high, and I'm excited to see what he can do and how he can impact the Seattle Kraken game. We had some of our YouTube commenters really talk about that IQ, the intelligence, and how Chandler Stevenson can push certain buttons, even on offense, that really help set the team up for success. So that's something that I will be looking for in today's game. But coming up today on Locked On Kraken, I want to, get a little bit more into the roster, because once again, we did see some players reassigned. And in addition to Stevenson and Daccord, who are some other players that I'm looking out for? I think there's some obvious ones we'll talk about. But then also, what is Dan Bylsma expecting from this team and this outing, knowing that they just played, at least in theory, this franchise, if not this exact roster? We'll talk about that coming up on today's episode of Locked On Kraken. Today's episode of Locked On Kraken is brought to you by our friends at Indeed. Now, if you need to hire, then you absolutely need Indeed. Now, you can ditch the busy work with Indeed, because Indeed you can use for scheduling, screening, and messaging, so you can connect with candidates much faster. And the great thing about Indeed is that you're not necessarily searching. It is more about the match feature. Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree Indeed delivers the highest quality candidates or matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent survey. And if you are a listener, which of course you are, to Locked On Kraken and the Locked On Podcast Network, and you need to hire, then it is time that you use Indeed. And you, by being a listener of this show, will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this very podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. But if you need to hire, then you need Indeed. Today's episode of Locked On Kraken also brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Game Time has this super cool new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out all of the fluff, so you're only looking at incredible deals for baseball games, concerts, theater events, and so much more. Now, I also want to let you know about the all-in pricing. Now, this is a feature that you can toggle in the app, and all-in pricing will show you the total upfront with no surprise fees at checkout. And of course, there's still the game time guarantee. If you find the same ticket for the same event, same row, same section for less than what you pay at Game Time, they will give you 110% of your purchase back. That is the Game Time guarantee. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Again, terms to apply. Create an account and redeem promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Oh, you best believe it is game time. Never get old. Thanks as always for making Locked On Kraken a part of your daily destination. Now, I went through the roster a little bit, but let's talk about some players I'm super excited to see in action. I have to say, now, again, in addition to Joey Daccord and Chandler Stevenson, who I think are uptick, they're on the rise, some other players that I'm really excited to see is going to be Shane Wright. And this is probably an obvious one. Of course, we're talking about Shane Wright a lot. But as much as I've been kind of hyping Shane Wright coming into training camp, I think that he has kind of settled into the culture of the team. And that's not a bad thing, but he doesn't stand out as much as he has in rookie and dev camp, which is completely understandable. For all intents and purposes, he's basically looking for his first full NHL season this year. So having him with having Wright with McCann and Eberle, if indeed what we saw at practice is what we see in the game, I'm really excited to see how this line develops. I can say that at practice this morning and earlier in the week, I saw Shane Wright and Jordan Eberle talking. And you could see that Eberle was kind of directing and giving Shane Wright some instructions. So I'm expecting that the last few practices have been really good for Shane to settle into this lineup, to settle into this line and centering McCann and Eberle. You've got Jared McCann, who is, one of our best scorer for the last 2 seasons. And then Jordan Eberle, who of course is a leader. So I'm really excited to see how this line comes together with Shane Wright. I'll tell you someone else that I'm pretty excited to see. And I want to go to the defensive side. Alexiak with Montour. That's really interesting. And even Evans and Borgen, I think, are going to be very interesting. I'm not super high on Jamie Alexiak as a true defenseman or the defense that he offers. That being said, I think his size is great. And so playing alongside someone like Montour, who we have also heard can absolutely skate, I'm looking forward to that defensive pair. And I mean, I'm going to say it again because it's absolutely true. I think I'm probably most excited to see what Joey Daccord is going to do in net. Now, with a back-to-back, I'm assuming that we'll see Philip Grubauer tomorrow. And this will be a really good time for us as Kraken fans and as the media to get a feel for how these goalies are coming in. Now, does it mean we're going to know who gets the nod and who's going to be the number 1 goaltender? Absolutely not. But these next 2 games, I think, are critical. And I said it before, I was not impressed with how the Seattle Kraken played defense in front of Philip Grubauer in the first preseason game here at Climate Pledge Arena. That was just flat out messy. And if you watched yesterday's episode, then you heard Zame and I talk about it. I'm not expecting the same tomorrow or even tonight for that matter. However, unfortunately, we have seen things get a little bit messy in front of our goaltenders historically for the Kraken organization. So I really am, of course, I always am locked in, no pun intended, on what's happening defensively. But I'm super, super, super excited that I get to be here for Joey's start and that I will be watching Philip Grubauer tomorrow. But question of the day, who are you most excited to see given this roster? Again, it's Tolvanen and Beniers, Bjorkstrand, McCann, Wright, Eberle, Schwartz, Stevenson, Tanev. Interesting. Cartier, Gord, Winterton, Hayden and Stevens also there for forwards. And then on the defensive pairings are Dunn with Larson, Alexiak with Montour, Evans, Borgen, Mahura, and Fleury, excuse me. So let me know in the comments on YouTube or on social media, who are you most excited about? And then, of course, we'll talk about it on our next episode, who we thought really performed. But coming up, I also want to talk about what are some keys for today. We'll hear a little bit more from Dan Bylsma. And then I also have to tell you about some players that have been reassigned and or have been placed on waivers with the hopes, or with the intention, I should say, of them going to Coachella Valley. We'll talk about that coming up on today's episode of Locked On Kraken. Today's episode of Locked On Kraken, as I said at the top of the show, is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Now, for NFL fans, we've got some really cool news for you, some cool things that you can do now directly on FanDuel. So we know that FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. And so when you go to FanDuel now in the middle of the game, maybe you have a hunch on something, you'll be able to see the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You want to talk about instantaneous information data to help you make responsible bets. This sounds like a pretty good deal for NFL fans. And you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet over at FanDuel.com. Yes, that's FanDuel.com. So remember, you're not only finding NFL stuff, even though you can find the live stats, play-by-play, all that stuff there. You can find futures bets. We've got the WNBA semifinals starting this weekend. Unfortunately, the Seattle Storm are out of it, but it's still going to be a good time. My New York Liberty are still in there. And you can find all of this stuff right on FanDuel. So again, visit FanDuel.com. That's America's #1 sportsbook. And of course, our sportsbook right here for the Locked On Kraken and the Locked On Podcast Network. All right, everyone, the DJ's picking up. That means it's almost time to defend the deep. At least that's what it says on the screen here. We're about 44 minutes away from the start of this game. And again, I'm super excited. I think the vibes, the good juju has just been increasing every day in camp. I'll tell you what, Dan Bylsma and the rest of the coaching staff, they are definitely working this Kraken team. And I think that's really good. Speaking of good news, we did see Andre Burakovsky today. We were actually in the little interview cubby. If you ever see them standing at the lectern or the podium, whatever you want to call it, the microphone, they being Kraken players, and of course, Dan Bylsma. That's in a little cubby area just outside of the locker room, just before you, there's on either side, like kind of the stick rack. And so Andre Burakovsky, as we're waiting for Dan Bylsma, I forget exactly what he said, but he also turned into the cubby and he said, hello, everybody. Like, he was super excited. He was on the ice getting some reps with Vince Dunn, actually. So, that's someone else that we got to keep an eye out on. But it was good to see those two having a good time. Very jovial is what I tweeted from Locked On Kraken. And, it's a good sign that he's still maintenancing. That's a quote that we heard from Dan Bylsma and that Zame and I talked about on Thursday's episode. So the maintenancing is maintenancing. The maintenance days are maintenancing. I don't know. He's under maintenance, and he did get some time on the ice. The game roster skated. Nobody else skated except for Vince Dunn and Andre Burakovsky. I'd say they were out there for maybe 40, 45 minutes. I was recording another podcast earlier at KCI, and so that was good to see. Now, a few other things that I want to mention for the Seattle Kraken is that we did hear that the following players are headed to Coachella Valley. So kind of what we expected, that roster is starting to round out. Tucker Robinson, who I got to interview when he was with the Mavericks. Ty Nelson is headed there. Jack LaFontaine. I still have an interview with Jack that I'm going to put up for our insiders. So I got to do that. Victor Ostman, Ian McKinnon, David Goyette, Logan Morrison, and Jagger Furcus. So these are the names that we more or less expected to see with the Coachella Valley Firebirds, and also players that we expect to make a splash, so to speak, with the Firebirds. But having them for a little bit longer in camp, I think is a solid move. So we'll see what happens with that. Now, we also heard that the Seattle Kraken have placed 2 players on waivers with the purpose of them being assigned to Coachella Valley, and that is one Luke Henman and Nicolas Brouillard. So those are the roster updates. But let's talk about the roster hitting the ice for tonight, because Dan Bylsma was pretty clear with what he wants for this squad. And it's not really about playing the same team, because, again, the roster, the personnel is likely going to be different because it's still preseason for the Canucks as well. Their roster is a little bit different. They've practiced a few different things. So it's not necessarily necessarily a like for like against the same opponent. It's a matter of taking what has been emphasized in practice and being able to implement it on the ice. And anyone on the roster should be able to do that. But let's hear what Dan Bylsma had to say after morning skate today.
Yeah, I just think establishing the tenacity and the compete of this team is a night-to-night basis, and we got to keep doing it. That doesn't mean should be extracurricular activities in the game. It means there should be a high level of compete, and so that it's really not so much about playing the same team over again as us establishing the level and the standard of how we're going to compete every night.
And so what is the new identity of Kraken hockey? We know they want to play fast. I think forechecking is going to be a part of that. And then Zame and I talked about this yesterday, and we actually had an interesting comment on YouTube as well. Where does the third F? Fun. Usually I say that one first, but if you listen to the show, everydayers and OGers, you know my 3 Fs are fun, fast, and forechecking. Where does fun fall into play? Is this going to be a fun team? Zame talked about stagnancy on the special teams, especially the power play, and how maybe there's going to be a little more fluidity. I know for me personally, when I have some free reign to roam and be creative, I tend to have more fun. Some people like more rigid structure, and that might be the big difference that we're seeing between Dan Bylsma and Dave Haxtell. And I think there are players that will absolutely thrive under a more fluid, fun system. And Andrei Burakovsky, even though he's not going to be on the ice and on the roster tonight, he's likely one of those people. Now, how, if at all, will Dan Bylsma be able to also rein in the players that they need absolute structure? They want to know where everything's happening. Now, you can't realistically do that, but as someone who has been known to be a little demanding or borderline controlling, I understand that part of it too. You have to be able to balance that. You can't be too laissez-faire and free-flowing, but too much structure also doesn't always set yourself or your team up to give their best within a rigid system. So I'm going to be seeing how the Seattle Kraken respond. Again, I do think that every game has gotten progressively better. And so in theory, this will be the best one yet of the preseason. As you can hear, they are testing out the system here. So we're going to wrap this show. But tomorrow is another game day. And so the excitement is that we're going to get more Kraken hockey. We're going to get more Kraken Hockey Network. It's going to be my first time really getting to watch the Kraken Hockey Network. Zame also gave a really good disclaimer about how things are going to be a little bit different in the preseason. So sometimes you'll have to watch on Amazon Prime, but that won't be the case in the regular season. Anyway, I'm excited. We've got a new DJ here. DJ Trunks is still holding it down at Storm Games. Got to see him earlier. But we've got the DJ here getting us ready for warm-ups, which will start here soon. So I'm going to wrap this one up. As I wrap up every show, remember to be kind to yourselves, Locked On Kraken listeners. And once you give yourself enough grace, then you can spread that love to other people. Be kind to others as well. Let's hold fast. Let's stay true and loud and proud. We say, whether you're in CPA like me or watching at home, let's go Kraken. I'll see you on the next episode. Peace out, everybody.